Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the transition protocol that was introduced in iOS 17. It provides us with a way to change the way a view enters or removes from the view hierarchy. We can get creative and use a number of set transitions that are of type AnyTransition provided to us by SwiftUI, or we can create our own. So let's take a look at both of these cases. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. There is a starter project for this video and you can download it from the link in the description. There are two branches, so make sure you download the starter project branch. The completed branch contains the completed source code for the video. You can just download and expand the zipped archive. Now, the starter project is a pretty simple app. There's a starting tab view that displays both of the views that we'll be working on during this video. In the end, you'll have a completed application that you can run on your phone or in the simulator that you can use for future reference as we go through the Transitions API. This is what we plan to accomplish. We'll look at simple transitions, and this will be followed by more complex and combined transitions with custom animations. Currently, this first view has a number of group boxes where we'll add some code. The first group box has a VStack with an if clause that displays a text view depending on the status of the Boolean showText field. The button has a conditional label of hide or show based on that Boolean state, but tapping on that will toggle that state, and the text view appears or disappears with no animation. Now, there's a couple of things wrong with how this appears and disappears, in my opinion. In the first place, when the view appears or disappears, the action is very abrupt. And we can fix this by enclosing the action within a with animation block. Well, this is a bit better. The default behavior of with animation applies implicit animations. The text fades in and out, but we want to be able to animate the other 5 group boxes here, and each one of them will have a button that will toggle that same showText Boolean. So what I can do is I can remove the with animation block around the action here, and then I can apply a animation modifier to the entire VStack, specifying a linear animation based on the value that will change, which is showText. I still find this a bit jarring. In a VStack, when the view is removed from the view, the button has to move up to fill the space. So what I'm going to do for this video is to add an else clause to the if showText, and in there, I'm going to present another text view just displaying a space, and then to ensure that the size will be the same as the first fade in and out text view, I'm going to apply the same font of a title. Now, as the initial text field disappears, the other one takes its place with no movement of the button. In iOS 17, we were given a transition protocol, and transitions allow us to do much more than just simple opacity fading when we remove or add a view from the parent, as we're going to be doing here. What we have here is exactly the same as applying a transition modifier to the view that's being inserted or removed, and that type is opacity. If I apply this transition, we have no visual effect, as we already have implicit animations that is an opacity transition. Well, we can override this, though, by changing the transition type. For example, in this view, if I change the transition type to identity, what happens now is the view doesn't change at all. It's inserted and removed very abruptly, and our implicit animation is overridden. I'm going to change it back to the opacity and move on. So I'm just going to copy the entire VStack, and then I'm going to collapse the group and paste this into the next group box. If you don't have the ability to collapse your containers, I recommend that you go to the Xcode settings, and on the text editing tab, make sure that you have code folding ribbon selected. Now change the text view string to slide in and out. And then change the transition to slide. Now when we tap on the button, we see a new transition as the text view is inserted or removed from the view. It slides out to the trailing edge, but slides in from the leading edge. Notice that the animation modifier is being applied to both of our group boxes. Transitions cannot occur without an animation of some state property. Now, if you still have that original group box VStack on your clipboard, we can move on now to the next group box and paste it in there. I'm going to change the text view to move to from trailing. And then I'm going to change the transition from slide to move. And now you see that we have to specify an edge. And you can see that we can choose from either bottom, top, leading, or trailing. So I'm going to choose trailing. Now when we tap the button, it moves off to the trailing edge as it's removed from the view, like the slide transition. But when we tap again to insert it, it comes back from the same trailing edge, unlike the slide transition. So let's test out a scale transition. So again, we'll collapse the other group box and paste our starter code from the opacity transition into the next group box. And I'll change the view string to scale down and out. And I'm just going to change the transition to scale. When we tap the button now, it gets removed by scaling down. And when we tap again, the insertion is a scale up. Moving on now to the scale with argument group, let's repeat the process. And I'm going to change that text string to scale up and out. Well, if we want to scale up when it's being removed from the view hierarchy, we can provide an argument to the scale modifier. And that scale value is a CG float, so any value higher than 1 will scale to that value as it gets removed from the view. A value less than 1 will shrink to that value when getting removed. So we can set that scale to 1.5, and when we tap the button, it scales up and out. If we set it to 0.5, it'll scale down, but only to half the size before it gets removed. If we set it to 0, that would be the same as the scale without any argument. Well, there's also an anchor that can be applied. And the default anchor, which is a unit point, is a scale where the view scales from the center of the view. So we can add an anchor and choose where we want the scaling to originate. For example, if we set the anchor to leading, the leading edge stays fixed and the scaling happens in the opposite direction. You can play around with that anchor point to get any effect that you want. Now onto the final option here before we start getting more creative. The offset transition gives us the ability to specify an offset for exiting and entering the view. For example, we may wish to exit via a direction that is up and to the right, and we can specify how much of an offset before it gets removed. So once more, we'll start with our basic one. I'll change the text view string to up and trailing. And for the transition, I'm going to choose an offset and specify an X and Y offset. So to move towards the trailing edge, we can specify the number of pixels. So let's say 300. And then to move up, we'll need to decrease in the Y direction. So for Y, I'll choose, say, -50. Tapping the button moves the view up and to the right before being removed. Now, unlike the move to trailing, it'll get removed as soon as the X and Y offset is reached, and not necessarily when it gets to the top or trailing edge of the view. If you want to get fine-grained control over that, you might have to consider something like a geometry reader so that you'll know what your current space availability is. So those are the basic transitions. Well, let's get more creative. The second tab works just like the first one. I already got that starter view in that first group box. Now I want to combine two transitions. For example, let's apply the transition to our text view and start with a move to the trailing edge. But we can also add a combined with modifier and specify another one, like opacity. Now, as it moves to the trailing edge, it also fades. Well, we can keep adding on to this. Like, for example, we could add another combined with and specify a scale with a scale argument of, say, 1.5. Well, that's getting pretty long, pretty complex. So let me just play around with this, and I'm going to go back to just the move and fade. And instead, I'm going to move on to my second, where I'm going to create a custom transition. So if you use a transition like we just had here all of the time, we can create our own custom transition. So outside of the view and the preview, create an extension to AnyTransition. That's what those transitions are. And we can create a static property that are instances of any transition types, and we can apply whatever transitions we want. For example, let's create a static property called Move, Scale, and Fade, which is of type AnyTransition. And then we can specify an instance of AnyTransition. So we'll start with a move, where the edge is to the trailing. We'll combine this with opacity, and then we'll combine both of those with a scale to a value of 1.5. So now I can go back to the view, copy that previous VStack and paste it into the next group box. And then we can replace the transition that we had in the first view here with a simple .move, scale, and fade. And I can also change the string in the text view to move, scale, and fade. Now, as it transitions out of the view hierarchy, it scales and fades as it moves to the trailing edge. So I'm going to copy this version of the VStack for future use now. Well, sometimes even those combinations aren't enough. So SwiftUI has the ability to create our own custom modifiers using a ViewModifier. And that's what we want our views to end up being once we've transitioned in or out. So let's create a ViewModifier that's going to allow us to transition using a scale and rotation of the view. So I have a complete tutorial on view modifiers. So if you're not familiar with them, I suggest that you watch that video. A link will be in the description. Well, a view modifier is a struct that conforms to the ViewModifier protocol. So I'm going to create a struct called Scale and Rotate Modifier that will conform to the ViewModifier protocol. And this requires a body function that will receive the content that the modifier is going to modify and return some new view that we're going to modify. We can use this content then that we got and modify it. If we're going to scale and rotate, then we can make our modifier flexible to allow us to receive arguments for the scale, angle, and perhaps opacity that can be different for a transition in as opposed to a transition out. And that'll be our transition modifier. So let's create three properties. Scale as a CG float, angle as a double, and opacity as a double. And then to the content that we're modifying, we can apply a scale effect, passing in that scale, a rotation effect, where the degrees are the angle that we specify, and then an opacity that will be the opacity that we specify. So then back in our AnyTransition extension, I'm going to create a new static property that is going to be an AnyTransition. So I'll call it Scale and Rotate. But this time, I'm going to use an AnyTransition with the modifier. And then this gives us an active and an identity that will accept a view modifier. When it's active, we want the modifier to be our new Scale Rotate modifier, where we can scale down to a factor of 0.3, counterclockwise, so an angle of minus 90 degrees, and then to an opacity of 0 before it gets removed. But when we're coming into our view, making it active, we want that same view modifier, but we want to scale up to 1 with no rotation, so an angle of 0, and an opacity of 1. So if we go back to our view, we can use that same view that we've been using. We'll change or apply a transition that is our new scale rotate transition. And I'll change the string in the text view to be scale and rotate. As we test now, as it gets removed from the view, it rotates 90 degrees counterclockwise, scales down to 0.3, and its opacity goes to 0. And when it comes into the view, the opposite occurs and it rotates clockwise, scales back up to identity and to full opacity. Well, there's one more option that we have to control over the insertion and removal of a view, and that is to use an AnyTransition asymmetric option. This will allow us to specify a transition for insertion and a different one for removal. So for example, I'm going to create a new static AnyTransition property called slide, fade, or scale that is of type AnyTransition in our extension. Then I'll use the AnyTransition.asymmetric option, and you can see that we'll get an insertion and removal argument where both of these are AnyTransition types. So for the insertion, then we can specify any transition we want, like a move to the leading edge combined with opacity. And then for removal, though, we can use another one, and we can specify a move to the trailing edge combined with a scale this time, but no argument. Returning to the view, then we can do our thing by pasting in one of the previous ones. I can change the string to slide in, scale out, and then I can use our new transition. Now when testing, we fade in from the leading edge, and then transition to the trailing edge while scaling down to nothing as it moves out. Let's just do one more then to complete this video. I'm going to create another static extension to the AnyTransition, and I'm going to call it Mixed. Again, this is going to use an asymmetric AnyTransition. For the insertion, we can use any one of our custom or static properties that we've already created, like move, scale, and fade. And then for the removal, we can choose a different one, like scale and rotate. And finally, then we can return to the last group box. We'll paste in that V stack. I'll change the string to mixed transitions, and then change the transition to just be the mixed one. And then as we tap that button, we get exactly what we asked for. A rotation out of a counterclockwise direction. And then as we come into the view, it moves in from the right as it fades in and then scales down. I think that you can get far more creative than I have here, but you have to at least have a starting point that you can use to spice up your own UI. Don't go overboard though, as this can be distracting to the user. Sometimes too much of a good thing is just too much. But before I leave you though, I have one more thing that we should do. If I go to the Start view right now, you can see that I have an issue with the first tab. The content is encroaching on the navigation and the tab bars, as it's just too much of a view. Well, I can fix this by returning to my Simple Transitions view, and I'll just change the V stack to a scroll view. Now I'll no longer need the vertical padding, so I'm just going to change the padding to just be horizontal. And when I do that, the view scrolls, but I don't like that the scroll bars are right at the trailing edge. So I can apply a content margins modifier of 10 for the scroll content. So this brings the content in from the edge to allow the scroll indicators to be away from the scroll view. If I return to my Start tab view now, I see that our presentation is fixed and I can scroll for the first view, but it's not necessary for the second view. If you found this tutorial helpful, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment. You can subscribe to my channel to get notifications of new videos. And remember that you can also download my YouTube channel listing app for free and quick access to all of my 350 plus YouTube videos. A link's in the description. And also remember I have a full SwiftUI course available on my Teachable site where you learn how to build a fun multi-targeted app.